Hello and good morning or afternoon or evening.
Afternoon,
Yes,
late afternoon.
that's true, exactly. All right, so Ian, I'm going to bring you on in a second. I'm just going to say hello to everybody. So I'm talking to them, not you right now. So just
Yeah,
to be clear, okay, good. Hi, guys. Thanks so much for joining me here. We are doing a special extra bonus Watercolor Rules webinar to talk about all things watercolorish today. And we are lucky to have Ian Sidaway joining us again to talk about all kinds of things and to answer any of the questions that you have. So if you are ready, let me just bring Ian on here without further ado. There he is. Hello,
I
Ian. Hi, Ian. And thank you for joining me. So I am in Phoenix, Arizona, where it is 9 o'clock in the morning, and you are
in Strawberry Hill, where it's 5 o'clock in the evening.
perfect. Okay, good. Well, we have a lot of people here from Germany. I see people from Chicago, San Diego, Massachusetts, Maine, Maryland, Holland, Greece,
Oh
Michigan,
my God.
etc.
Wow.
So there's a lot of people. And guys, if you have any questions for Ian, please post them in the comment section and we will answer all of them. So, Ian, it's been a little while since we've talked about watercolor. Have you been
Yeah,
watercoloring of late?
I have pretty consistently. Yes, there's a few shows that I have to get work.
Oops, now you've frozen for a second. So, so, so,
Yeah,
so you're a member of the rather august sounding, is it the Royal Watercolor Society? Can you tell us what that
the
is?
Royal Institute for Painters in Watercolor.
Oh, even more august. Tell us what that is.
Well, there are actually two in London. There's the Royal Watercolor Society and the Royal Institute of Painters in Watercolor. So there was many years ago there was a schism, and we
Ah,
parted ways. But we come back together again periodically. So
so what was the schism about? Was it?
it all started off because the Royal Academy, which had an annual exhibition, never used to show watercolors. They looked down on watercolor many years ago,
Hmm,
and and so consequently, watercolors were never shown. So a group of artists got together, wanted to put on a watercolor show, and half the group wanted to include the general public, and the other half didn't. So it's split.
I see.
But now they both include the general public in their open exhibitions.
So what is the sort of the mark against watercolor in the sort of painting world? How's
Well,
watercolor seen?
then it was seen as substandard. It was seen as something that young people and ladies did. It wasn't really considered to be a serious art form. But of course now it is. So
I'm not sure what's changed, but maybe it's just become more democratic.
maybe, yeah. Although it is taken seriously, and an awful lot of people like painting watercolors.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, good. Well, so when you get ready for a show, what do you do? Like, what do you have a theme for the paintings you're going to do? What's the
This
process?
particular show that I'm working, I hate theme shows. I hate the restrictions, but this particular show that I'm working for, which is going to be on in a place in Norfolk, is called Transformation. So it's a pretty open, and in fact, I'm wriggling off the hook by they're mostly paintings of trees because I figure trees transform themselves
Absolutely,
constantly. So
exactly. And watercolor itself is inherently about transformation in some way, isn't it?
absolutely,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. All right, good. So I see people are starting to post questions. So I'm going to just go through them in the order in which they were posted, and I'll put them up on the screen, and we'll have at them. Okay. So let me just see. Here's the first one. Um, sorry. Okay. So this is from MK Buke. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but her question is: Moleskin paper has changed in the last year or so. Do you still like the watercolor sketchbook paper? If not, what sketchbook do you use now?
I do. You're right. It has changed slightly. I still do use Moleskine paper books. I like the books. I like the way they're made. And I know a lot of people find the paper slightly slippery. but I quite like the paint sits on the surface. It doesn't soak in very much, and so you're always left with a lot of watermarks and drying marks. But I quite like those because they add character to the sketches. So no, I still use water Moleskine books, and I'll continue to do so. I haven't found another book that I like better.
Yeah, nor have I. I mean, I've used all the different sizes, and particularly the landscape one is so unusual.
I
Really,
love the landscape one. Yeah, yeah.
I hadn't noticed that they changed. What is the nature of it? Is this the chemical treatment of it?
I guess so. I guess so. I mean, others have noticed it more than I have to admit. But I've noticed online, people have commented about the changes. But I still find the paper very good. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, I hope that answers MK's question. Here's a question from Rosemary. She says, if you're attempting gradients wet on dry, is there any technique that can help them attain more midtones? I've been practicing, but I can't seem to get a good range. So wet on dry, yeah.
Wet on dry. Really, I would say it's simply a case of testing your mixes. I mean, when you've made a wash, rather than just applying it, always test, because you can always knock a colour back by adding more water or adding more pigment to make it darker. So I think it's simply a case of testing. But watercolours do have a tendency, when I'm the images tend to run to the mid-tone always. I don't quite know why. I think it's a building up of the layers. And I always find that when I've finished a painting, I often leave it alone for a while and then go back. And if I darken the darks, which has the effects of making the lights look lighter, it stretches the mid-tones and increases the contrast. And it can really liven a painting up. Simply by darkening your darks.
So is that generally the last thing that you'll do in a painting, is to go in and
it would be, yeah. I mean, I always, not all over, but in any specific area, I'm always working light to dark. So I'm always working the lightest colours first and the darkest colours last of all. And sometimes it just pays to go back to those dark colours and darken them a little bit more.
Right. And it's obviously easier to make things darker, I suppose. I mean, you can pull out lights,
yeah.
But yeah.
You can always you can make areas lighter, but you really need to do that at the beginning of the painting, because you're washing pigment off, and you really don't want to do that when you've spent an awfully long time on making an image.
I mean, one of the things that strikes me about the way that you work is it just feels like your colors are sort of crisp and sharp. Is that also a function of not overworking stuff?
I guess so. It's also the fact that I'm mostly working wet on dry, so I'm going to get crisp edges all the time. Mm-hmm. I tend not to do too much wet into wet work, where colours diffuse one into the other. And I work with a limited palette, so. And I use a lot of gum arabic in my mixes. And gum arabic has the effect of intensifying colours, as well as making them more transparent. And it also has the added effect, which I'm often talking about, of making dry washes very easily soluble. So you can re-wet dry areas and remove the paint. But you have to be very careful with it. If you overdo it, your colours mix together and you end up with a bit of a mess.
And are you adding gum arabic on your palette? Is that how you do it?
Yeah, you add a few drops into your mix, into your wet mix on the palette.
I see. Okay,
but
good.
I tend to work with fairly large mixes. I have these mixing palettes where I'll mix quite a large quantity of wash, and I add my gum arabic to that. And if those dry off in the course of a few days, I just put in more water and reconstitute it again, you know.
If you're working on something over the course of a long period, then yeah.
Yeah, and also too, I mean, colours, you can take one mix onto another painting. You know, I mean,
Okay.
like I have a pot of a really a wonderful black, which I just keep adding to, adding more pigment in, more Gamarabic, more pigment, more Gamarabic, and it just stays there on the desk. And if it hasn't been used for a few days, then it will dry up. But I just put more water in, you know.
Yep.
I mean, there's very rarely a need to throw washes away, because you can always reuse them. You know, the only problem is with working like that is gradually all the washes become dirtier and dirtier and dirtier. So you end up with slugs. So a point is reached where you do have to wash everything off and start again.
Right. All right, good. So Gail has a very general question here, which is mixing colors can be a real challenge. Any tips? So that's a rather broad question, but let's see what you have to say about that.
No, it's best to try to arrive at the colour that you want by mixing no more than 3 colours. That's a tip I would say, and that's in order to keep your colours bright. But remember, if you're mixing, say, I mean, that's if the colours that you're using are single pigment colours, that they're made from a single pigment. Don't forget, say, a colour like Payne's grey is made from 3 different pigments. Sap green is made from 3 different pigments. So you mix sap green and Payne's grey together to get a dark green, and you've already mixed 6 pigments together.
Right.
Then if you add a little bit of sea, then, you know,
right. So
easily find your colours getting dirtier and dirtier and dirtier. So try to arrive at the colour that you want by mixing 2 or maybe 3 colours at the very most.
And of course you can figure out what your pigments are by reading the label on the tube, basically.
Yes, you can. It's always the pigments that the colour's made from are always on the wrapper.
Right.
I mean, it sounds easier than it actually is, but gradually with experience and time, you can look at a colour and you can think, I'm going to need ultramarine for that. I'm going to need a little bit of ultramarine and a little bit of cadmium lemon and a little bit of, rather than experimenting, if you see what I mean. But that only comes with time. But if you're new to it, you can be dipping your brush in all various colours and desperately trying to arrive at the colour you want. And the colours just get murkier and murkier and murkier. And sometimes you're moving so far away from what you wanted or anticipated. So it can be tricky. But I believe that no time is wasted in just playing. If you just play, if you just sit down with your paint box and just mix colours, it's not a waste of time and it's not a waste of money. All the time you're learning. So I would advise doing that.
And so that's why working with your color wheels, your color charts, your swatches, all the types of things that we talked about in the first week of the class is really valuable.
Exactly.
And
I no longer do that. Although the thing I do, of course, is every time I mix a color, I test that color first. So I've always got pieces of scrap paper by my side, which I'm testing the colors on. And if a great tip, I don't know whether you have it in the States, but we have a thing here called lining paper, and you buy it at DIY stores. And what it is, it's for you use it in exactly the same way as wallpaper, but you line your walls with it, either to receive a coat of paint or to put wallpaper on top of it.
Right.
And you can buy it in different thicknesses. And it's really, really cheap. You buy it in rolls, like wallpaper. And it is the most fantastic paper for playing around with. And it costs no money at all. And I always have a roll of that in the studio. And I'm just tearing off pieces and testing my paints all the time. And that saves you having to test those colours on expensive watercolour paint.
And is it like butcher paper? Is it that kind of heaviness?
I understand what you mean by butcher's paper, but it's slightly more substantial than that.
Even more so.
And it's a clean white, and there are no imperfections in the paper, and it's great for drawing on too. It has no archival qualities whatsoever, but for paper to work on, to throw away, to experiment, it's perfect.
You could make your own wallpaper out of it. Yeah.
Well, you could quite easily. Yeah.
Okay, so Cheryl has a different question for you, which is, how do you start a composition? Do you, on site or in the studio, do you first work it out in pencil or pen? Do you go straight into watercolor? What is your process of planning out a drawing?
I will often make a few little sketches. Thought I had a book here. If I can show you. Can you see that?
I can't. Hold on 1 second. Let me just get rid of me so we can have you be the focus of this thing. There we go. Okay, yes, go ahead.
There are these Moleskine books, which are a quadrille. They're divided up into squares. And I often have one of these in my pocket so that I can do little compositional sketches just in pen. And they're just little experiments in possible compositions. And I have loads of these. And it's often just a first step.
Mm.
And sometimes they get a little bit, they get a bit more involved, a little bit larger. This is a waterfall in the Lake District. But it just means I can work out a few ideas very quickly. And then, there's some panoramic ones. And then I'll go on and there's some in Canada. I go on and then make finished paintings in sketchbooks like this. And I always tend to work on this panoramic format. But I never make paintings in the studio like this. I always crop them down. And I come back with loads of these images. And from these, I'll work out a composition on a larger scale in the studio to make a finished painting. And I also take a lot of digital photographs. I'm always referring to digital photographs, but I very rarely end up working from a single photograph because I like piecing elements together from various photographs. Well, that tends to be my working process.
I think any of us would be happy with just your compositional sketches there, but the final things are spectacular. What are you thinking about when you're doing those? I mean, I presume that you're doing multiple little compositional thumbnails of a scene.
Be anything. It could be. It's hard to explain exactly the element that takes me, the main thrust of something that takes me. It's a combination of things, I think, and the way that they fit together, especially in the landscape work. And I think that's one of the reasons I like moving things around and taking elements from different places. Like some of the paintings I'd made of British Columbia last year, of the lakes. I used clumps of trees from one lake and put them in another, just simply because that clump of trees was far more aesthetic than the ones that were. So I do that all the time. And the main thrust of a composition, it could be the sky, it could be a few clouds, it could be a fence, it could be a run of trees, a clump of trees, and all the time I'm trying to balance things. I'm trying to make the image work as a whole, put all those individual little things together so that it reads easily as a whole, and your eye moves around it and through it in a satisfactory way.
Now, it's interesting that you're doing all of these panoramic compositions, but that you said that when you go back to the studio, you're not. So presumably your composition,
I don't know.
so your composition is going to be, the
I
balance will change completely when you're changing
Well,
the
it
format
will,
to,
but
right?
I section. Usually, I end up sectioning a portion out, or I might even use the main part of a composition, but make the
Have
image
more
more
sky or
rectangular.
something like that, yeah.
So I'll put more of a sky in, or
Right.
more of a foreground, and I quite like large skies and large foregrounds. But large foregrounds are always more of a problem than a large sky, because a sky, you don't necessarily have to put anything in it.
Right.
But a large foreground, there always has to be something in it, really, unless it's an expansive lawn or
Snow or
you
something
can
like
get
that,
around
yeah.
it, I suppose. But and also because technically your foreground is always closer to you. So it demands more detail, if you see what I mean.
Right, right.
So you have to think quite hard if you're going to have large foregrounds in your images, because you've got to fill it with something. Whereas the sky, although it's important, it's slightly less important, because you can get away with just a blue sky and a few clouds if you want to.
But the thrust of what you're trying to communicate with a composition like that has a large sort of blank space somewhere else is, it's almost as if you're looking out and you're just focusing on something far away, and that's why there's detail there, and everything else is just sort of blurred or
Yeah, and
simplifies.
obviously too, it's sense of place. I mean, you're always striving in that. And some places in the landscape, you've just got a big sky, whereas other places the sky isn't so big,
Right.
because it's overcrowded by trees. So you're always picking up on those elements that are important in any particular place,
Right.
and maybe trying to exaggerate them a little in a way.
So particularly if you're doing sort of the Canadian wilderness or something, some place that feels like big sky, big, you know.
Exactly. And the thing I found with it in Canada, of course, was this. You've not only got horizontal elements, but you've got very strong vertical elements, the trees. So I found myself working with those two things an awful lot, and one intersecting the other. Yeah, but it's difficult to say what in the. I mean, I see compositions everywhere. I see potential for pictures all the time, and of course, the other thing that I do is that I visually edit an awful lot too. I not only move things around and add things, but I'll leave things out. And sometimes you see a composition that's ruined by something. Well, the easiest thing is just
Cut
you
it
can
out.
play God. You just move. You just leave it out.
Right, exactly.
And I remember. I was working in Venice. I had some students with me years ago, and we were painting in Venice. And I noticed a lady painting one of the palazzos, and she was very carefully counting the windows, and she was going to great lengths to make sure that there was the correct number of windows. And I said to her, when you're home and you're showing your friends the paintings, no one has a clue how many windows are there. Now, obviously, it's a good idea to try and get things correct and right, but sometimes you don't have to be quite so pedantic. You know, you don't have to. It really doesn't matter.
Right. You're not an
So
architect or.
sometimes I do. That does occur to me sometimes. I think to myself, well, that looks great, but let's get rid of that.
Right.
So it's a much better composition without that.
Exactly. Or else just take a photo.
Or we'll take a photo and then just leave bits out. You know.
Okay. So Liz says, she asks, what do you do to mix the very dark colors that look black in your watercolors? What actual colors are those? What's going into that?
I tend to use for my darks mostly Payne's grey and sepia, but I do also use lamp black.
Oh, you do.
And occasionally, on a watercolor, at the very last thing, if I want some really darks, real blacks, I use Indian ink.
You do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Why?
that gives me the intensity. And as I say, I also, by mixing this gum arabic into the mix, that can add a little bit of depth to the color as well.
But generally, if you introduce black, if it can contaminate other things so much, is that one of the
I
reasons to
know.
avoid it?
Well, there's this there's this thing that people will say, shadows, they're never black. They're never black. And that in all honesty might be true, but a really black shadow on a picture can sometimes look terrific. So I have no qualms in using black at all. You just have to be careful, I guess. Yeah.
But black shadows can also overwhelm, right? They can just draw your eye too much to one thing.
They can. But
yeah.
I do use black quite a lot in my shadows. So.
But I think it's also
and another thing that I do is I mix a lot of my own pigments. I'll just buy jars of pigment, which I mix with it's made by Sennelier, and it's a watercolor. It's for making watercolors. And so I have these trays where I mix pigment with this Sennelier mix and mix it up, and it just dry off after a while, and it becomes like a hard pan of watercolor paint. But I find that it gives me really good, deep colors. And one of the reasons I think is that, and it granulates really well because it's not ground as fine as watercolors. So you often get really nice granulation effects, which in shadows can be really effective. And I'll in with my shadow mix, and when it's painted and it's drying, it'll granulate, and the ultramarine settles out a little bit, so you get this ultramarine sheen in your shadows. It's just a little trick, but I find that it can be quite effective.
So your Skype froze for a second when you first introduced that idea. Could you say the part again? Was it? I gather you were saying that you introduced ultramarine into the blacks, do you? Or explain that again?
It's an ultramarine. It's one of the pigments I use. But I mix this ultramarine pigment with this. It's a watercolor medium from Sennelier, and it dries into pans eventually.
Yeah, no, we got that part. Yeah, it was just the first. Yeah, we got that part.
And I just put it into mix it into my mix, and it granulates out. It separates a little bit when the paint's drying on the paper. So you get a nice. It's not exactly a mottled effect. It's a granular effect.
Right.
But the blue, you get this blue sheen shining through, and I that's something I do quite a lot.
So that's another reason not to use just pure black or even India ink, is because of the flatness of it. Whereas when you get
anything, I mean, you do have to be careful. But after all, I'm not trying to paint. I'm not trying to reproduce reality or reproduce a photograph. You know, I'm making a painting, and I want that painting to have various effects going on. I want people to look at it and see it as a painting, as an image that I've put together using various techniques. So I'm never after trying to have a photographic reproduction of what I see.
Right. So, okay, here's another specific question from Eileen, who says, I love the clear blue green waters and white sands of west of Scotland beaches, but I'm not sure what colors to use. Any tips?
Yeah, you could try using Viridian green and phthalo blue, maybe, which is a really powerful blue, with a lemon yellow. You might find, and you can very carefully knock those the colors are going to look very bright, but you could knock them back a little bit, just with maybe a little bit of Payne's grey or sepia. You have to be, again, you're testing all the time, testing your mixes all the time. But Viridian or Viridian, say, and cerulean blue makes a really quite a nice turquoise, and turquoise is a really difficult color to mix. If if you're going to buy a special color to use, buy a nice turquoise, because you might not use it very much, but you know, when you really want a nice turquoisey mix, then it's there for you.
Oh, that's good advice. Okay, so several people have been asking questions that Amanda has sort of summarized in this one, the similar question, which is, do you ever, basically they're asking about the difference between mixing on the palette and mixing on the page. And when you're doing these experimental test things, is that something that you're mixing on the palette? Or if you mix it on the page, how do you control that so you can reproduce it?
These are colours that I will be mixing on the palette.
Okay.
Mixing a quantity of that wash, which I intend to use. And in order for it to make sure that it's the correct tone or the correct colour, I'll be testing it on a piece of paper all the time. And if it's not quite right, adding a little bit more pigment or adding a little bit more water until I find I've got the exact colour that I want. And then I can go and use it on my actual painting. As I said before, I don't do an awful lot of wet into wet work. Any wet into wet work that I tend to do, it'll be at the start of the painting, where I will often wash in the sky and bringing it down and then changing the colour to an overall background colour. But that background colour has to be light enough for me to work on top of it with more colours without that background colour affecting the colours that I'm painting on top. Because you're always painting in layers, and a layer beneath another colour is going to affect that colour. So that's why watercolour in many ways is a little bit of an intellectual exercise. You're always thinking, looking ahead, sometimes several steps ahead, and thinking, am I going to encounter a problem here further down the line? And so, as I say, this testing of colours is really quite important. And it's not so much on the image itself. It will be on a piece of scrap paper.
So that's interesting. So this sort of looking at it like a chess game means that you have to have a destination in mind almost before you set out. Then,
well, you do, but it's simply because with watercolor, often people are painting away and it's all going very nicely, and then they think, oh, I want a really light, beautiful yellow square on that black, horrible, dark area there. And I hadn't worked that into. So it really is as simple as that. You're looking ahead, thinking, what is the order of work here? What is the order of application? What is the order of washes? And can I get away with washing all over that area? Is that colour going to be hidden by subsequent layers, or is it going to affect subsequent layers? So sometimes you can work very loosely and wash in whole areas because you know that your subsequent layers are going to be dark enough or of a colour that's going to hide what you've already painted. So you have to be very careful, because you might go crazy and then think, well, that colour's showing through and I don't want it showing through there. That's why people resort to things like masking fluid, or I mean, working around light areas or white areas is a case in point. And you have four ways of going about that. You can either use masking fluid and mask out the area that you want white, and then paint your image. Once the image is finished, you rub off the masking fluid and you're left with your white mark.
Right.
Or you can paint around that area, which is extremely time consuming and sometimes really awkward. Although, having said that, it's something that I tend to do quite a lot, surprisingly. You can, what's the other one? Or you can use white gouache.
Mm-hmm.
So you can paint the picture and then resort to white gouache or Chinese white.
That feels like cheating there.
And paint in your white area. Or I come back to the gum arabic again. And if you've used gum arabic in your mixes, you can paint your painting. And once it's dry, you can work on the areas that you want that are light with clean water, allow it to redissolve the paint for a few seconds, and then blot it off with toilet paper or kitchen paper. And you will go pretty much back to the bare watercolor paper. So there's 4 ways that you can create white, but you're also you're also working in that way when you're painting any color. You've got to think, do I need that color to show through at any point? So you are always thinking ahead.
Now, so when you're making those compositional thumbnails, you're thinking not only in terms of the picture structure of where the elements are, but also in terms of tone, and also possibly in terms of the process in which you'll build that image, right?
I wouldn't say so much at that point. Really, I'm thinking about just composition.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly when I'm in front of the painting to be, and I'm working, I'm thinking, how am I going to make this picture work? I will then begin to think in terms of layers and what I need to do and when I need to do it in order to make everything fit together.
Right. All right. So sort of vaguely related, Thistle asks, do you have the entire image set in your mind before you're painting, even when you're making a composite, as you said?
No. I mean, I often find that as I'm working, I think, no, that's something else I need to leave out, or I need something else there, and so I will add something. I mean, I personally find it quite easy to do that, and I know that I mean, artists have always, Canaletto, I mean, he moved Venice around. Paintings don't always correspond to the way Venice actually is. So if he can move things around, then I certainly can.
But I also wonder, I assume that you don't have a completed picture in your mind that you then have to just go ahead and execute, but that you're continuing to go through a process of discovery and experimentation while you're making, or else it would feel pretty dull to make something, right? If you just
Yeah, of course. And I'm not. These paintings aren't being the studio paintings. They are being made quickly. I mean, a reasonable sized painting can quite easily take me 2 weeks, and it's not, although I put in long days in the studio, and I might be working on 2 or 3 things possibly at the same time. The process is slow and carefully thought out and methodical, and it might sound boring. I mean, it's not. I'm not standing in front of an easel throwing paint around, and it really it might sound boring. It's considered, and each step is considered, and I have to think all the time. And experience tells me too, of course, what is going to work and when I need to do what.
Right, but I think that to get the sort of results that you get, this is your process. I think for other artists, and even the other artists in this class, we see people who kind of come in and just, they are virtually throwing stuff at the palette, at the canvas or paper, and seeing what emerges, and then responding to that, continuing to respond.
Of course, that's one way of working. I mean, I can only speak about my method,
right,
and my way of working. It's not necessarily the right way.
No, but it's the way
I work.
No, and I think to get the kinds of beautiful images that you get, controlled images that you get, that's the approach. I think that's up to people to decide what do they want to end up with.
In the sketchbook work, of course, I'm working slightly faster, and I'll be getting something done in a matter of hours rather than a matter of days. And it really isn't quite so important then. But even at that point, I will have, just by the very process of painting the image, it will have told me quite a lot about when I come to paint the painting in the studio, the studio painting. And sometimes I will have thought, I need to remember that. If I'm going to paint that there, I've got to be careful of that colour behind. So all those things are registering if I'm working in a sketchbook. But it's because it's not if it doesn't quite work out, if colours run together, if they aren't quite as true as they need to be, or it really doesn't matter. At least I'm going to go home with an image and something that I can build on.
Well, in a related thought, Jeanette asks, how do you cope with changing light when you're painting outside?
It doesn't bother me in the slightest.
I mean, do you stick with what you first saw and try to go back to that?
Usually, usually any shadows that I put on or any darker patches, as I say, will be at the end of the painting. So it's actually usually possible. I can make a painting in a sketchbook working outside, and it can be quite dull weather. And if the sun comes out, I can put some shadows in. It sounds flippant, but I don't mean to be, but I really do see it as being that easy. And it's the same in the studio. Sometimes I will make a painting, and I feel that something's lacking. And I think, well, it's flat, it's mid-tone, it's got no oomph to it. And so I can then maybe go about turning it into a sunny day. And you can do that.
Excellent. Well, Jenny asks, do you work on more than one painting at a time?
Yeah, usually, maybe at the most there'll be 3 images perhaps. But I do find that I'll put in a lot of time on one, and sometimes I'll reach an impasse and I'll put it to one side and pick up another one and do a little bit of work. Or if I'm working and it's quickly, I'll put in washes and move things over and then put in washes on another painting. One of the reasons being is that over the past 2-3 years I've started using Sanders Waterford paper. And Sanders Waterford paper, it takes a long time to dry. I used to use Bockingford, and Bockingford dries really quite quickly. I mean, you can put a wash on Bockingford and go and have a cup of coffee and come back and you can work on top of it. With Waterford, you can't do that. It could be a good 3/4 of an hour before you can resume work if you want wet on dry. And so that's one of the reasons I'll sometimes be working on more than one painting.
But you don't have you don't have hair dryers going and things like that.
Well, this is a point I was just going to say. I do use hair dryers, and hair dryers are really valuable sometimes. But a problem with watercolor and hair dryers is that a lot of those lovely watercolor effects that people are after happen because you've given the paint time to settle into the fibers of the paper, run together, do what it wants to do in its own time, of its own accord. You use a hairdryer and you can blow away all those effects. And I don't mean physically blow them away. I mean that you have dried the paint too quickly, so the effects have not had time to happen. A case in point is, say, simple granulation. Granulation happens because they're varying pigment size, pigments settling into the structure of the paper, the granulated surface of the paper. And you use a hairdryer and the paint dries too quickly before that happens. It's the same with those lovely watercolor drying marks that you get sometimes, which I know a lot of people hate. I quite like them. But if you use a hairdryer, you blow away all of that. So you do have to be careful with hair dryers. If you've made a flat wash and you want it to dry quickly so that you can work on top of it, a hair dryer is fine. But I wouldn't use hair dryers if you really want the watercolor paint effects to happen.
Right, interesting. Cheryl asks, if you're working on multiple paintings at a time, are you using different palettes for each painting?
Not always, no. I'll often use, they'll be the same colours. Because usually, if I'm working on several paintings at the same time, they'll be of the same place or a similar place. If it's a a stand of trees, say, I might have another version of that. So they'll probably be the same colours. And periodically, in fact, it's just happened today. I look at all my palettes in the studio, of which I have quite a lot, and they've all become the same muddy colour that is simply not going to work anymore. And I take them to the kitchen, and Lydia, bless her, spends the morning washing them all.
Oh, that's nice.
And then I get back a lovely pile of sparkling palettes.
That's nice. That's nice. So okay,
yeah.
so
but I tend to mix my washes, not so much in. I mean, most people, if I'm working outside, certainly, then I'll mix in the palette that's on the watercolor box. But in the studio, I have a lot of small ceramic disc-shaped,
like the mixing, little cups, yeah. Mm-hmm. Ceramic ones.
In fact, a short story is years ago. I was at a car boot fair. You have, as you have in the States, and there was this huge box that we used to have in this country. You still get. It's called Gentleman's Relish, and it's like an anchovy paste. And it used to come in these little pottery containers, usually with a lid with a beautiful design on top. Well, people collect the lids, but they don't necessarily want. Clearly, someone had collected all these lids and then thrown away into a box and they were just there, and they were just a few pounds. So I struggled home with this box full of, and I have hundreds of these things. Well, not hundreds, but quite a lot. And that's what I use in the studio.
Interesting, resourceful of you. So here's another question. How do you know when to stop and avoid overworking a painting?
Usually a point is reached where you kind of just know that it's enough, it's the end. But I always leave the painting stretched on the board, and it'll be up in the studio, and I'll look at it for a few days. And sometimes you just go back, and after looking at it for a while, something suggests itself. But usually a point is reached where it tells you. It just tells you that enough's you've done what you wanted to do, and it reads as you want it to read, and it's you have that sense of place, and everything fits in right, and composition's good, colour's good, and also too, I mean, I have to say that I reach a point where I've had enough of it, maybe, because I want to move on to something else. So that in a way tells me, let's put that one to one side.
Do you think, is it a particular issue with watercolor, just because if you overwork it, that's it, you're lost? Whereas if you, with other sorts of
image
making, you have.
Yeah, I mean, with oils, certainly you can go on pretty much ad infinitum if you're working in a certain way. But even oils, I mean, even with oils, it depends on how you're working, basically. I mean, I know people who paint in, I won't say watercolor, but water-based mediums, and so they use acrylic too, and they will just keep the way they work. It means it's a looser, more painterly way of working, and more a way of working that's more akin to oil painting in many ways. So they can continue to work, and they can continue to build up color and areas and textures, and whereas with most of the time with watercolor, even though there are ways of getting actual physical texture into the paint, most of the textures are they're an illusion. You're making textures that they're on a flat surface, but they're reading as textural effects. Whereas, so you really don't want to overwork an image too much, because you want the lovely texture of the paper to show through, and not overdo it. Yeah.
Right. I think this will probably be our final question, which is, I think we've addressed this business of changing light. So I think we're done with that. I think I think you've given us so much to think about, and you've taught us so much. You know, for those of you who are in the audience watching this and you aren't signed up for Watercolor Rules, you know, you've had a small taste of what Ian talks about in this class, but we spend 3 weeks with him going through every aspect of the essentials of watercolor, but also really how to break them. And then, of course, we have several other amazing artists who also basically lay waste to these rules of Ian's as well.
I think it's just to say, and I mentioned this to Kosha when she was here before, and I don't know whether it was recorded or not, but it's something that stuck with me. And I remember an interview with Bill Wyman, and Bill Wyman said, it's dead easy to learn to play the guitar, but it's not so easy to learn to play it really well. You're constantly learning. And the same, I think, applies to watercolor. I mean, watercolor is dead easy to use. It really is just dipping the brush in the water, mixing up some lovely colors, and splashing it onto a nice piece of paper. And great things happen. But then it becomes increasing. The more you want, the more you demand of it, the more complicated it becomes.
That's true.
So I think it is one of those mediums that I'm still learning. I mean, I look at young guys who are online, you know, young illustrators, and I'm blown away by what they're doing, you know. And it would never have occurred to me to work in the way that they're working. So we're all learning all of the time. That's
true. Well, you were the Keith Richards of watercolors, I would say. So
well,
thanks.
Nice of you to say so. I think I look better than Keith Richards.
It's true. It's true, actually. It's true. You're a young Keith Richards.
Keith Richards.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for sharing so much with us, and for sharing so much with us in the course. You know, you're such a big source of inspiration. And for those of you who aren't familiar with all of Ian's many books, you have to look them up because he's been writing books for a long time. I have an entire shelf of them. There's so many on, not just on watercolors, but on drawing, on lots of different aspects of art making. And everything he says is clear, interesting, fresh, and inspiring. So thanks so much for spending time with us today. And thanks to everybody else. Thanks to all of you guys for showing up today for this webinar, and also for kind of re-engaging with this class, because we put it out a few months ago, but it's great that it continues to be interesting and inspiring. For those of you who haven't signed up for it, I'm not sure what you're waiting for, jump in. I think if you're at all interested in watercolor, you know, there's so many ways of learning the essentials of it, so you can right away start making watercolors, but also there's so much to learn. It just keeps unfolding. Yes, Ian, were you going to add to that?
No, I was just going to say, and importantly, enjoy it.
Yes.
Because it's a really fun medium to work with. And the sense of enjoyment and the sense of achievement when something happens, and it's what you wanted to happen, and it's a great medium. It really is.
Particularly for the sketchbook. I mean, it's a fantastic,
very good,
fantastic way of.
And you need not too much equipment. You know, a paint box, a few brushes, bottle of water, and a sketchbook, and you're ready to go.
Exactly. Well, with that, we're ready to go too. Thanks so much. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you. We're going to have one more webinar and discuss watercolor further, but not with Ian, but with one of our other artists. So look forward to that. You'll see an announcement of it here on YouTube. You'll also see it in the schoolyard. Thanks for joining us. Thank you again, Ian. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.